Revolution. Part 1, Origins. The place is France. The time, the 20th century. The country appears peaceful and prosperous. The citizens of France enjoy many personal liberties. They're free to select and read whatever they wish. They may think and speak freely without fear of imprisonment or personal injury. Educational opportunities leading to good jobs are based on personal merit rather than birth. French citizens are guaranteed equality under the law and have a strong voice in their government as well. Delegates to the National Assembly, or lower house of Parliament, are elected directly by all citizens over the age of 21. But it was not always so. The liberty, equality, and fraternity so important to the French today were at one time only dreams. They had to be fought for and won. This was the time of the French Revolution, from 1789 to 1799. This 10-year period turned out to be one of the most turbulent in the country's history. A period when there were so many political prisoners that some of France's most famous buildings had to be used to hold them all. But the invention of the deadly guillotine by Dr. Guillotin alleviated the overcrowding. The nation's razor, as it was called, decapitated 35,000 to 40,000 people in a relatively short period of time. The French Revolution. Was it notorious or glorious? Much depended upon whether one was a member of the ruling clergy or aristocracy, known as the First and Second Estates, who opposed giving up any wealth and power, or whether one was a member of the Third Estate, a commoner, who had everything to gain from a revolution. The Third Estate was not only made up of peasants and artisans, but also of the bourgeoisie, a rising middle class of merchants, doctors, and lawyers with wealth and education. Whichever the case, a necessary attempt at social and political reform went out of control and eventually degenerated into a monstrous reign of terror. After many long years of unfair rule by aristocracy and clergy, the common man was finally in charge. But how did all this come about? Why did the people revolt? When the Bourbon king Louis XVI ascended the throne in 1774, he discovered that his main problem had to do with money. Or more precisely, the lack of it. For he had inherited financial problems from his ancestors, Louis XIV and Louis XV. The beautiful but extravagant Annette was Louis XVI's wife. This young queen from Austria pushed the country further into debt by indulging her own passion for jewelry and fine clothes. A great financial drain on the treasury of King Louis XVI was the cost of maintaining an extravagant lifestyle at the court of Versailles, an exclusive aristocratic world away from the city of Paris. Though it was Louis XIV, not Louis XVI, who built the fabulous chateau, the cost of construction was still being felt. Louis XIV was known as the Sun King and liberally embellished everything with gold. Waterways and fountains were created under almost impossible conditions and at enormous cost. So much so that the fountains were turned off once the king passed by. During the reigns of Louis XV and Louis XVI, Versailles was continually being redecorated or enlarged. While the Petit Trianon was built by Louis XV for his mistress, the hamlet was created by Louis XVI for Marie Antoinette. Here she tended sheep while pretending to be a shepherdess. Playing the part of a simple peasant was a popular game of the aristocracy of this time, as long as there wasn't any discomfort involved. Taking part in the American Revolution also contributed to France's financial woes, for it was very costly to send Lafayette and French troops overseas from 1775 to 1783 to help the oppressed colonists stand up to the King of England. However, it was something Louis felt he needed to do, because 20 years earlier, England had taken over the French colonies in Canada during the 7 Years' War. The English forced French Acadians to leave their homes and resettle in Louisiana. France wanted revenge. The Marquis de Lafayette and other French people were sympathetic to the American cause and helped organize a military effort. In 1778, Benjamin Franklin and other Americans joined French representatives in this building on today's Place de la Concorde to sign a treaty of friendship and trade. The document officially recognized the independence of the United States. Thanks to French aid, the American Revolution succeeded. After helping American colonists establish a democratic form of government, French soldiers returned home only to realize, ironically, that they suffered from a king's oppression in their own country. They wished that they too could have a say in how the government was run. As it was, Louis XVI's will was law. From the pens of the 18th century French philosophers Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau came new ideas about freedom, which said that the right to govern came from the people. The philosophers did not believe that it was a divine right of a king to do anything he wished, as the king had done for so long. To maintain its lifestyle, the French monarchy borrowed money rather than cut expenditures, but eventually it could borrow no more. In the past, a middle-class Frenchman with enough money had been allowed to buy a title of nobility from the king, who needed the money to operate his kingdom. This title could be passed down through the family. By the time of the Revolution, however, most of the titles had been sold, and society had become very rigid. The fact that one could not rise in society was a complaint of the bourgeoisie. They were equal to the nobility in wealth and education, but were not accepted as social equals. The monarchy received most of its money by taxing the people. However, the third estate, which was least able to pay taxes, was required by law to pay the most. Thus, the common people became very much overburdened. The farmer of today is able to operate his farm with certain freedoms. Because of laws dating back to the Middle Ages, the 18th century peasant was required to give a share of the harvest, money or labor, to the seigneur of the region and also to the church as a tithe. In addition, there were taxes on other items. Mountains of salt along the Mediterranean coast bring to mind that in revolutionary times, each person was required to buy a certain amount of highly taxed salt every year, whether they wanted to or not. Salt at the time was used to preserve their food. King Louis XVI's finance ministers wanted to tax the aristocracy as well as the peasants. To do this, however, the Parlement, or high courts, of each region would have to approve this idea. But the nobles who controlled the courts would not vote to tax themselves. Louis did not know what action to take next. His advisers suggested that he summon the Estates General, an elected assembly that had not met since 1614. Doing this marked the end of absolute government in France, for the king would now have to share his power. At the Chateau of Fizy in Dauphine and in other regions throughout France, the people began meeting to elect delegates to the Estates General. There was an air of excitement in the country. Perhaps the king would finally be receptive to change. Each local parlement prepared a cahier de doléances, or book of grievances against the crown to take to the Estates General. It was at the Chateau of Versailles, center of French government, that the delegates first met on May 5th, 1789. They came from all over the kingdom. Marseille, a lawyer. Even though he was of noble birth, he consented to represent the Third Estate, as he was sympathetic to its cause. A problem arose over just how the vote should be counted. Of course, the First and Second Estates, the clergy and aristocracy, preferred one vote per estate so that they could always maintain a 2-to-1 majority. However, the Third Estate, the commoners, wanted one vote per delegate. Since their group had the greatest number of delegates, this method would give greater representation. When the issue could not be resolved, the delegates of the Third Estate proclaimed themselves a national assembly with the power to write a new constitution for France. To show his disapproval, Louis XVI tried to permanently close the assembly's meeting room. The delegates met in an indoor tennis court instead. They swore an oath to meet wherever necessary until France had a constitution. This was the tennis court oath. A great fear began to take over the country when Louis brought more of his soldiers to Versailles. And on July 14th, 1789, a Parisian mob seized arms at Les Invalides and then forcefully took over the Bastille, a longtime symbol of injustice. In the past, many people had been imprisoned here indefinitely at the whim of the king. Today's Place de la Bastille marks the location of the old prison, which was demolished in revolutionary times. The stones were used to build other structures, such as this bridge. The Hôtel de Ville fell to the rioters after the Bastille, and a new city government called the Commune installed itself here. During the Reign of Terror, the Commune would become more powerful than the French government itself. The tricolor flag, which symbolized the change in government, dates from July 1789. The royal color of white was joined by red and blue, the colors of Paris. This was to become the national flag of France and is displayed most proudly on Bastille Day, July 14th, or French Independence Day. After taking over the Bastille, a need for a National Guard was felt, an army of the people, to stand up to the king's troops if necessary. Lafayette was selected to head the group. In all acts, the two acts together embody the spirit of the Revolution. The first abolished feudalism. A peasant was no longer required to give money or a part of his harvest to the seigneur because of ancient feudal rights, or to the church because of a compulsory tithe. The second act created the Declaration of the Rights of Man, an extremely important document which affirmed the sovereignty of the French people and also the liberty of each individual. Louis XVI agreed to these acts reluctantly. At the same time, women and soldiers were marching on Versailles. The women had complained about the shortage of bread because they were hungry. Terrible storms had ruined much of the wheat harvest the year before. Bread was scarce on the streets of Paris. Yet those at Versailles felt no hunger, as they had an abundance of bread to eat. After voicing their displeasure, the revolutionaries stormed the Queen's apartment, killing the Queen's bodyguard and forcing the royal family to return to Paris. They were confined to the Tuileries Palace, where the people could keep a close watch on the king's activities. No longer would the fabulous court life exist at Versailles, and no longer would the exquisite chateau hold its importance as the seat of French government. In a few short years, its gardens would be abandoned, its furniture auctioned, and its art removed. Once back in Paris, the children of Louis XVI played here in the Tuileries Gardens, as children still do today. Return to Paris, mark the end of an era. To celebrate the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, July 14, 1790, a festival was planned here at the Champ de Mars. It was called the Fête de la Fédération and honored the National Guard. During the golden moment of unanimity, Louis XVI, Lafayette's National Guard, and the Church rejoiced together. However, the rejoicing was short-lived, for the revolution had not run its course.